Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. This is KRWG, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Thanks for joining us on Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. We continue our election 2012 coverage now, and New Mexicans will be voting on 3 constitutional amendments to change the Public Regulation Commission, the PRC. The amendments are being supported by the nonpartisan group Think New Mexico, and I'm very pleased to have with us today from Think New Mexico, the director and founder, Fred Nathan. Fred, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you with us. Last time we were talking, it was in Santa Fe, so I didn't get to have you actually in person. I was looking at you on a TV screen, so it's great to have you right here in studio with us.
And nice to be in Las Cruces. It's a lot warmer than it is in Santa Fe, I can tell you that.
I bet it is. And, you know, before we get into the PRC, I wanted to give you a chance, Fred, for folks who are not familiar with the work of Think New Mexico, to tell us about what you do and some of the big issues that you've been working on over the years. As the founder, I'm sure this is something very exciting for you to talk about.
Yeah, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. So Think New Mexico is a results-oriented think tank serving New Mexicans. We're a little bit different than most of those think tanks your viewers may be familiar with that are either way, way over on the left or way, way over on the right. We just believe in a state that's 49th or 50th in too many of these national rankings, that the focus ought to be on solutions rather than ideology. Consistent with that, we have a board of directors of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. In fact, the chairman of the board is from right here in Las Cruces, former Governor Gary Carruthers. We also have a former Democratic Attorney General, Paul Bardicke. LaDonna Harris from Americans for Indian Opportunities on the board. Roberta Ramo, the first woman president. So I always get into this name dropping because usually it's the one person on the board that I don't mention who has a relative who's watching at home, and then I hear about it. But anyway, they're statesmen and stateswomen that just want to see the state go forward, and we're best known for getting a full-day kindergarten law through the legislature to make full-day kindergarten accessible to every child in the state, repealing the food tax, which took 3 years, reforming the lottery to get more dollars to the deserving high school seniors and less to the bloated operating costs, which have been significantly reduced, introducing free market reforms to the title insurance industry to make it easier for people to buy a first home or refinance a mortgage, and right now we're working on the PRC reform.
So let's get to that, because folks are going to be voting on this, and I would think it's fair to say that most people voting on this don't know a lot about these 3 constitutional amendments, and constitutional amendments are a big deal.
You're absolutely right. I think, you know, first of all, it's constitutional amendments 2, 3, and 4, and it affects all of your viewers, at least those that, you know, pay a gas bill or an electric bill or telephone bill or buy insurance of any form. Motor transportation, they regulate taxis, buses, limos, ambulances, wreckers, moving vans.
So it affects all of us, and these are very important positions. So that brings us to the First Amendment, and it's probably the easiest one to understand.
Right.
We have a highly important position, and it's also a highly paid position, especially in the state of New Mexico. Your first constitutional amendment says PRC members, if they want to run for this office, they need to have certain qualifications.
That's exactly right. So this is Constitutional Amendment 2, and basically when you look at the PRC, and you're right, they're paid $90,000 a year, there are 5 PRC commissioners, and they have enormous power. In fact, this is the most powerful state regulatory agency in the country, but with the fewest qualifications. The only qualifications, Fred, to be on the ballot, or to be a PRC commissioner, is that you be 18 years of age, lived in the state for 1 year, and not be a convicted felon. Essentially what an elector is, someone who can vote. But yet,
so almost no qualifications. Basically, you don't even have to have a high school diploma.
You don't even need an elementary school degree. I mean, no educational qualifications, no professional qualifications. And if you sit in on their meetings, they have to know a lot about a lot of different things, and it's really akin to being a judge on the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, because you're taking a lot of very complicated evidence involving engineering, economics, law, and then applying it to statute which is really what it's a quasi-judicial position. It's what judges do. And more states are moving to a system where their utility regulators have to have some professional and educational qualifications.
Okay, so what are those?
Well, so it was very difficult. So to get a constitutional amendment onto the ballot, you first have to go through the legislature. And so the way it's going to work is that the legislature, if this is passed, will then increase the qualifications and also have to provide for continuing education courses for PRC members. What we're going to advocate for is something of a sliding scale, so that PRC commissioners either have educational qualifications or professional qualifications, and ideally both, but the greater educational qualifications, the less professional qualifications or work qualifications that are required, and vice versa, because we want to be broadly inclusive.
So the legislature will ultimately decide on the qualifications, but one thing is for sure, if this is approved, there will be continuing education opportunities for these PRC members.
Right, really two, the continuing education and increased qualifications.
Increased qualifications,
and it would
we
be
just
hard
don't know
to,
yet
right,
what those are.
Right, and it would be hard to make them any lower.
Okay. The other, the next
Yes.
amendment, which would be number 3, I
Yes.
guess, is transferring the chartering and regulation of corporations from the PRC to the Secretary of State's office.
That's correct.
Okay,
So
tell me about why this is an amendment.
And that's a good question. It's because we have, right now the Secretary of State, for example, registers LLPs, limited liability partnerships. The PRC regulates or does the filings for LLCs. And in 41 states, it's all consolidated. There's a one-stop shop. And in this economic environment, we want to make it as easy as possible for businesses. Now, some of your viewers may wonder, well, why don't we consolidate it all at the PRC instead of the Secretary of State's office? And the easy answer to that is the Secretary of State's office is working beautifully. The Albuquerque Journal has chronicled some of the dysfunction in the corporate reporting unit of the PRC. And just because many of your viewers may not be familiar with this, really all that's involved is filing some basic paperwork saying, here's who our board of directors are, here's who here's our agent for service of process. And it should be just a 15-minute thing where you hand in your paperwork, they read it to make sure it's correct, and stamp it. It's now taking up to 2 weeks, and it's gone from $30 to $300 if you want an expedited filing. And so we want to make this business-friendly and more of a one-stop shop, and follow the pattern that most states use.
Okay. Speaking of what most states do,
Yeah.
Many folks have lived in states where there's a state superintendent of insurance or an insurance commissioner.
Right.
The next constitutional amendment would remove insurance regulation from the PRC and create a state superintendent of insurance for New Mexico. Why do this? What's the
I'll
reasoning?
give you 2 good reasons, Fred. First of all, just to give you an example, this has also been sort of a dysfunctional unit, and what we're really trying to do is pare back the PRC to their core mission, which is regulating utilities. Insurance is a competitive industry, and it needs to be regulated in a different way than utilities, which are monopolies, essentially. And the 2 problems that they've had there is that the superintendent of insurance, for example, last year, they had 5 superintendents of insurance in a 4-month period. And essentially what you have is one person answering to 5 political bosses, each of whom has a different political agenda. And so it's become something of a revolving door. And that leads to, of course, terrible management problems.
Plus, it's tough for anybody to have 5 bosses, I guess.
Can
right?
you imagine? I mean, it's the only setup I've ever heard of this. It would never be tried in business, and I don't think it works in government either. The second problem that they've had is that in the 16 years of the PRC, the Department of Insurance has been on probation with their trade association, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, 3 times. They just recently got off, in fact. And what's happened, and the reason that they've been put on probation in every case, is that the PRC commissioners who oversee the department sometimes recommend their own friends to be in the PRC, to be in the Department of Insurance for jobs for which they're not qualified. So the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has to check and make sure you've got the right number of auditors or a minimum number, actuaries, those sorts of things, and they haven't really had those qualified people that they need, so they keep getting put on probation and then taken off. And we think it would be better just to take them away from the PRC and take away that temptation to sometimes put political cronies, candidly, in positions where you need people with greater qualifications. So we think it would really be addition by subtraction to remove the Department of Insurance, and this is Constitutional Amendment 4 from the PRC.
All right, let me ask you one other thing about that number 4. As you're aware, some states have elected insurance commissioners where voters have a say. Why did you avoid this route in this constitutional amendment?
Great question, Fred. There are 11 states, I believe, that have an elected superintendent of insurance, and we looked at it very carefully, and we found out that they had their own host of problems with that. And what you're really trying to do in insurance is create a balance between the needs of the industry, and they have to be able to make a profit, and the needs of consumers to get a fair price. And there's always a temptation when you have a superintendent who's running for insurance to sometimes demagogue in either direction. And so this process would take the superintendent out of the political process altogether and would be nominated by an independent committee made up of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and really try to drain the politics out of what has been, unfortunately, a hyper-political environment.
Okay, well, speaking of politics, I know from your website that another issue that you're working on, you say New Mexico should ban political contributions from lobbyists and from government contractors. As many of our viewers are certainly aware, the federal government has banned federal contractors from making political contributions to federal candidates way back with the Hatch Act in 1940.
47, I believe it was.
Okay.
And it
your website was wrong then.
Okay, we need to fix that then. And it was Senator Carl Hatch, we should know this, who was a New Mexican who passed the Hatch Act in the United States Congress. And here we are 60 years later, and the same thing goes on in the state. And I'm sure your viewers are familiar with all the pay-to-play allegations and scandals where government contractors make political contributions and then lo and behold end up with a piece of business that really they're not qualified for. I mean, it's really sort of a similar issue than like the last one. And you know, it's interesting, Fred, when I talk to people around the state, this is enormously popular with everyday New Mexicans. It gets somewhat toxic when you go into the Roundhouse in Santa Fe and suggest that they shouldn't be able to make contributions, and it's the same thing with lobbyists. We believe that those people who have a conflict of interest and want something from government ought to stay out of the process.
Of course, as you're aware, in the judicial realm in this country, the direction has been going in the opposite way, with less regulation on how folks make political contributions and even disclosure of those contributions. It was interesting to me, I didn't see on your website where you've taken a position on Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that has been at the center of this. What are your thoughts on this?
Another really good question, Fred. So we read Citizens United, which is a long opinion. And in there, it was interesting, the court said, where you have a situation where a law is narrowly tailored to fight corruption, and we could spend the rest of this show just talking about the political corruption cases involving lobbyists and government contractors. When it's narrowly tailored to prevent corruption, those laws are upheld. And so we believe that if this law were passed and we prohibited political contributions by lobbyists and government contractors, and if it were challenged, we believe the courts would uphold it, and they could cite as precedent Citizens United, which, as you know, as you stated, opened the floodgates. And so we're trying to restrict it in this one tiny but very important area.
Okay, let me ask you something else related to this that has been connected to this whole issue. Some believe that disclosure should be clear. When someone pays for a political advertisement, we ought to know who is paying for this. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. We're for full disclosure on everyone, including not-for-profits, by the way, because that's been an issue as well. And
yes, some not-for-profits that have been created since Citizens United.
Essentially to launder political contributions, which has given all of us who work in the not-for-profit sector a black eye. So I'd like to see something done in that area as well. So, and I have to be careful because I shouldn't be so holier than thou. Of full disclosure, I'm a registered lobbyist. I like to think of myself more as a public interest advocate. But as I've told the legislature, I'd be willing to sacrifice the ability to make those political contributions, because generally speaking, we're usually fighting interests who have 100 times the financial clout that we do at Think New Mexico, and we just want to fight these issues, whether it's PRC reform or title insurance or whatever it is, on the merits rather than who's given more money.
Okay, I've got about a minute left. You mentioned at the beginning of the program you successfully got full-day kindergarten. You're now working on preschool in New Mexico. Tell me about that.
Well, preschool, I think we've made some progress there and we've got some funding. The other sort of outstanding issue that we want to get across the finish line is smaller schools. And in New Mexico, we have this funding formula that pays for construction of schools in addition to local property taxes, about $100 million. And it's a completely political formula. And there's 40 years of research that indicates smaller schools get higher graduation rates, fewer dropouts, of course, higher student achievement, higher satisfaction among teachers, principals, and students. But yet that isn't a part of this formula. And what we're trying to do is amend that formula to make it possible to build more smaller schools where we'll get higher graduation rates. And I know Stan Rounds here in Las Cruces just opened a school that's working in conjunction with the State University.
Early college high school, absolutely.
Fantastic, and they're getting kids from all over the community, and they have an enormous graduation rate. I mean, I think it's in the high 90s, which is just proof that we need to move in the direction of smaller schools.
Fred Nathan of Think New Mexico. Fred, it's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Fred, thank you for having me.